Hello and welcome to the Regional Studies Association Professional Development webinar series. My name's Sally Hardy and I'm going to be chairing today's session. We're going to be looking at all aspects of open access, open research, open data, and there will be an opportunity for you to ask some questions at the end of the session. I'm going to begin just by giving you some housekeeping information. So the Regional Studies Association, as many of you will know, is the global and interdisciplinary network for urban and regional research, development and policy. We're a membership organisation and we support our members in a variety of ways, mainly through our 6 journals, our 2 book series, our blog and e-bulletin and e-zine. And we have a very extensive series of conferences, networks, seminars and workshops. In terms of housekeeping, this webinar is being recorded and the recording will be put on the RSA Lounge. That means it's free to access for anyone who is an RSA member. If, as we're going through the webinar, you have questions, please use the Q&A box for your questions. If you want to tweet about the event, please use the hashtag RSA webinar to do that so that we can find and amplify your tweets. Feel free to use the chat box to introduce yourself and tell us where you're attending from. So I'm going to introduce our speakers now. We have 2 speakers. The first is Andrew Kelly. Andrew works for Taylor & Francis, the publishers. He's portfolio development specialist, and he's particularly looking at strategic and structural developments on the fully open access portfolio. So a real expert to come and join us today. Our second speaker is a very long-time colleague of mine, Sarah Bird. She's done party pieces for us before at these webinars. It's great to welcome you back, Sarah. Sarah leads the Geography and Regional Studies portfolio for Routledge, and in effect is one of my key contacts at Taylor & Francis. So I think that's enough from me. Perhaps we'll go straight now to you, Andrew. I think you're going to kick us off. Welcome, and we look forward to hearing from you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Sally. And hello, good morning, good afternoon, everybody. Hopefully you can see the slides. Okay, I'll start. So my name's Andrew Kelly. Thank you, Sally, for the introduction. I'm a portfolio development specialist in the open research team at Taylor & Francis, and joined by Sarah. By way of a brief outline to start then, we'll begin with a general introduction to open research, and then we'll focus a little bit more on open access and its benefits more specifically. Sarah will then lead us through a nice case study of publishing open access in the RSA journals, and then I'll pop back with a little bit of information towards the end about the different ways in which you can access support to publish your work on an open access basis. So as noted on this slide, open research is a really broad, almost catch-all term for a range of practices and approaches that are collectively aimed at making research more transparent and readily available. In this webinar, we'll particularly focus on open access, and we'll go into more detail on other forms of open research in future webinars early next year. So let's begin with a foundational definition of open access. OA is a publishing model that makes published articles freely and permanently available online. The biggest benefit to open access is that the published articles can be downloaded and read and then cited without the need for a traditional subscription to the journal, and so are much more widely available, both within academia and then also to non-academic readers, so policymakers, industry, and to the wider public. There are a few different types of open access. Typically, when we think about open access, we're talking about gold open access, in which an article publishing charge or an APC is paid by authors themselves, or more commonly their funder or their university, if their paper is accepted for publication, that then covers all of the publishing costs associated with publishing that piece of work. The article is then immediately made freely available online, and also authors retain the copyright for their work. Taylor & Francis has a number of agreements with libraries and funders so that authors don't always or often don't have to pay the APCs themselves. And we'll go into, as I say, we'll go into some of the ways in which you might be eligible to publish Gold OA at no cost to yourself later in the presentation. You might have also come across the term green open access, which refers to making available an earlier version of a paper. So typically the accepted version following peer review, but before copy editing and typesetting and putting it into the journal template and proof corrections, which we would call the version of record. The accepted version can then be hosted in a university or a funder repository. And under green OA model, this non-final version of the article can be made available without paying a publication fee, although in this case the publisher retains the copyright for the work, and an embargo period of typically 12 months, 18 months applies to protect the value of the final published article. So bringing the last couple of slides together then, you can see the green OA option is in the middle, which makes that accepted version of the manuscript available. Gold open access option is shown on the right, and that makes the final version of record available. And then at the other end of the process is uploading a pre-peer review version, which we commonly call a preprint or an author's original manuscript, the AOM on the slide, to a preprint server. And we'll go into a little more detail on that in this next slide. This one is a little bit wordy, but it gives you a bit more detail about preprints. So the idea being that you're publishing an early working version of an article, which then allows you to receive feedback, but also recognition for the work that's been done earlier in the publication process, that then can be incorporated into the article and improved it and iterated upon, ready for then submission to the journal. As noted on the slide, your institution or your funder or your journal may have particular guidance around how these different versions of an article, the original manuscript, the accepted version, the version of record, can be shared. So we would always recommend checking with your funder's policies, your university's policy, having a look on author services before you begin writing up your work. And we do have some guidance. I say author services, we have some guidance on which version of your article can be shared and how and where on our author services site. And there's a link there for circulating the slides maybe later. Okay, so having gone into the definitions of open access, this next slide pulls out some of the main benefits. So as I mentioned at the top, the key value of publishing an article Gold Open Access is that immediate availability of the version of record, publicly available immediately on publication. Typically, Gold Open Access articles are published under a Creative Commons license, which allows for the copyright to be retained by the authors, and then for that work to be reused and iterated upon without requiring permission or paying a permission fee. Although some variants of the CC licenses include some restrictions, so for example on commercial reuse, and your funder may have particular requirements for the license that you can publish your work under. I'm going to hand over now to Sarah, who is going to share a bit more of a case study looking at the RSA portfolio, and I will gamely try and move the slides along when I get the cues.
Thank you, Andrew. So as Andrew's discussed, the benefits of publishing OA for increasing visibility and impact, I thought I would try to quantify that by taking a look at how the different publication models compare in the Regional Studies Association's flagship title, Regional Studies. So I assume you're all familiar with the journal, but for a brief overview of the publication options it offers. So Regional Studies is a hybrid journal, which means it publishes both Gold Open Access, which is sometimes called Open Select or Hybrid Open Access, articles that are always accessible to everybody, as well as articles that are usually only available to subscribers. It also supports green open access. So as Andrew's described, that's where an early version of a manuscript is posted to an institutional or subject repository or to a scholarly collaboration network such as ResearchGate. As green open access is supported through the subscription publication model, an 18-month embargo applies before the author's accepted manuscript can be made freely available as an open deposit. But during that embargo period, the accepted manuscript can be posted as a closed deposit, which is where it is posted to an institutional repository and made available for those on the institutional network to access. Repository staff can then make this an open deposit after the relevant embargo period has passed. Alternatively, an author can post their original manuscript instead of the accepted manuscript, and no embargoes would apply there. So the following slides are going to take a look at the impact of publishing open access in regional studies. For this, I used recent data from the Dimensions platform. And just a note on what Dimensions is and how it works. It uses data from both preprint servers as well as publishers. So that enables us to identify what versions of regional studies articles are available. And with this, we can compare the impact that having a freely available version of an article has on article attention, which for the purpose of the following slides is citations and usage. So I'm looking at articles published from 2018 to 2022. And just a very quick note that Dimensions uses the first published date. So if there are both online and print publication dates for an article, the publication date used is the earlier date. So that's the date that this data will be referring to. Okay, so I started by looking at downloads from the Taylor and Francis platform. So articles published gold open access, so that's open select or hybrid open access in regional studies typically receive more than 4.5 times as many downloads compared to those that are not published open select. So this slide shows cumulative average downloads received between 2018 and 2022 for articles published in the same date range in regional studies. For the purpose of this slide, the yellow block is gold open access content. So that's publications that are freely available under an open license, as Andrew has described earlier. And the grey block is non-open access. So that refers to everything else. So that may include articles with an early version deposit, green open access, free access from the publisher, or closed access articles where no freely available version was identified. By the end of 2022, non-open papers published in the date range had accrued an average of just over 750 downloads per paper. Gold open access papers had accrued an average of just over 3,500 downloads per paper, which is more than 4.5 times the non-open access average. So moving on to citations. Articles published gold open access, so again, open select or hybrid open access in regional studies typically receive almost double, so 96% more citations compared to those that are not published open select. So this, in a similar fashion to the usage slide, this slide shows the cumulative average citations received up to the 31st of December 2022 for articles published between 18 and 22 in regional studies. Again, for the purpose of the slide, the gold block is gold open access, so freely available under an open license. The green block is green open access, so where we've identified that there's a freely available early version via a subject repository. The blue block is closed access, where no freely available version has been identified. So there is no gold or hybrid open access, no publisher free access, and no green open access that we could identify. And as before, the grey, which in this case is a line on the charts, refers to everything that's not published under a gold license. So that includes all of the various early version deposits, green open access, free access from the publisher, and closed access articles. So this slide shows that by the end of 2022, closed access articles had accrued an average of 4 citations per paper. Papers with a green OA version available do better, with an accrued average of 8.5 citations per paper, so just over twice as many as closed papers. And gold open access papers had accrued an average of just under 14 citations per paper. So that's more than half again as many as papers with a green open access version available. If we look at all of the non-open access combined, so that's the grey line you can see on the middle of the chart there, that's everything that's not gold open access. Those papers had accrued an average of 7 citations per paper. So gold open access receive around double the citations of non-open access papers for this time period in this journal. As an aside, but it's interesting, there's a study from Springer Nature which explores researcher preference for using and citing the version of record compared to other article versions, such as the accepted manuscript and preprints. So we'll also drop the link to that in the chat in case anyone's interested. Okay, and it would be wrong of me to come to an OA presentation with the Regional Studies Association and not mention their fully open access journal, Regional Studies, Regional Science. So RSRS is a full open access journal, which is a journal where every article is gold open access immediately on publication. There are no restrictions on sharing the version of record, for example, depositing it to a repository, and no embargo periods for doing so. As publication in fully OA journals requires payment of an APC or an article publication charge, we offer discounts and waivers to researchers in developing countries to enable them to publish in their fully open access journal of choice, as every researcher should have realistic open access choices available to them regardless of their funding. The RSA also have a mentored section in the journal which supports early career researchers through the publication journey. And that section also covers the cost of OA publication. RSA members get a 20% article publication charge discount when they indicate their membership on submission to the journal. And the RSA have other grants and schemes to support researchers in publishing OA in RSRS. So it's worth finding out about those on the RSA's website. I'd also like to have a quick shout out for RSRS, which has just got its first impact factor, and it's gone straight in at 1.9, so that's excellent, and it's had a site score for a number of years, and the most recent is at 3.3, so it's a journal that's fully indexed and covered, and I was just very pleased to drop that in there. So I think I will pass back to Andrew, who can talk us through the mechanisms of institutional open access.
Wonderful, thank you very much, Sarah. We'll now spend the last few minutes going into a little bit more detail about how you can access funding to publish your work on a gold open access basis in the Regional Studies portfolio. This one, I'm afraid, is another quite a busy slide, but it outlines, first of all, what we mean by open access agreements, and then the two main types, the transformative agreements and OA memberships. OA agreements or open access agreements more broadly are prepayment accounts that are set up between Taylor and Francis and a partner university or consortia of universities, which then allow researchers to draw down on by requesting use of the funds following the acceptance of their article for publication in an eligible journal. Of these two main types, transformative agreements, which you might also know by read and publish or R&P agreements, are purposed to support the sustainable and gradual transition of a library's access from paying for traditional subscriptions to a journal or a package of subscriptions to supporting the APCs for their researchers, or the work that's produced by their researchers. The read bit is the retaining access to the subscription content and ensuring that researchers can continue to access subscription journals, whilst also moving towards the publish part, covering the publication charges for their researchers. And R&P, or read and publish deals, make this transition over time and try to balance growing the proportion of the researchers' work that is published on an open access basis, whilst also ensuring that the faculties and researchers can retain access to all of the research that they need to do their work. OA memberships typically sit separate to subscription arrangements and are pots of funds that researchers can use to publish their work on an open access basis. They tend to be more 1 year or shorter term agreements between the publisher and a university, and tend to supplement other forms of access and allow allow researchers to publish their work on an open access basis. So, as noted above, there are several benefits to this type of an agreement. Firstly, the main one is they support making new research gold open access immediately on publication. They're also typically agreed at that university or consortia level, and so I think really quite importantly can be accessed equally by researchers working both in STM and particularly HSS subject areas where perhaps access to funds to publish on a gold OA basis are less readily available through funding bodies. Larger deals also allow for a bit more negotiating and greater value for researchers through discounting options. And then also researchers then don't need to find the funds to support gold OA publication either themselves or from research grants. Okay, so this is the last slide, and it goes into a little bit more about the transition that academic publishing has been involved in, really, or has seen over the last few years, and really emphasizes now the large number of open access agreements that are in place with the major publishers. So Taylor and Francis now, for example, has more than 90 open access agreements in place with universities and consortia that support researchers in more than 25 countries and a large number of participating institutions. As noted on the slide, each of these agreements is often unique and depends on the requirements of the particular university or particular funder. So we would always recommend having a look at the list of active agreements before submitting your work to check that either you are eligible or the journal that you're submitting to comes under a particular agreement, as agreements can differ in the journals or the journal models that they support. If you want to publish your work on an open access basis in an RSA journal, taking advantage of an eligible agreement is hopefully, I would say, very straightforward. New submissions to RSA journals are made through the online submission system. And if the paper is accepted, the contact details that you provide on submission for the corresponding author are then transferred into our production system, as is usually the case, so that you can be contacted about proof corrections and the publication of your work. But then those contact details are also cross-referenced using the Ringgold identification process against our active agreement and are routed down the appropriate pathway if your contact details correspond to an institution or a consortia where we have a corresponding agreement. Eligible authors should then automatically receive the appropriate open access license agreement, and the article would then automatically be published on an open access basis. This does mean, though, as a caveat, that it's absolutely essential that you use that institutional email address or appropriate contact details when submitting your work, so that our production system can match you up with the appropriate agreement if your paper is accepted. Then the link at the bottom of this page is to a public list of all of our open access agreements. I think one of the nice things about OA agreements is that they are all in the public domain, so you can view them and you can see the terms by which the publishers and libraries agree these packages. And you can click on your country of affiliation and view all of the agreements that are available to you. But to call out one or two now that may be particularly relevant for those in the webinar, Taylor and Francis has active translational agreements with the GIST consortium in the UK and some key agreements across Europe, including the Bibliosan consortium in Italy, with VSNU in the Netherlands, with the Spanish National Research Council in Spain, and with Max Planck Digital Library in Germany. So that is the end of the kind of the formal part of the presentation. If you have any questions or would like to discuss anything in more detail, then by all means take them now, or do get in touch after the webinar with me or Sarah. Thank you very much for your time.
Thanks very much, both Andrew and Sarah. Andrew, do you want to stop sharing your screen now?
Yes.
Lovely, thank you very much. We've got a question in the Q&A box, but first of all, I just want you to clarify that the fact that there are 90 OA agreements doesn't mean it's only 90 institutions worldwide, that those agreements will be many consortia, so it will be hundreds of higher education institutions.
Very much so. So I called out the agreement with JISC, which I think in itself is 80, 90 universities. Is that right? I think, yes, very much so. And some of them are national level agreements that then cover, a large number of institutions.
Lovely, thank you. I'm going to go to Sabine Dorry's question, which is in the Q&A, which actually is about books. Now, I know that Taylor and Francis Books Company is a separate company to the Journals Company, but I'm hoping that you've got enough experience to speak across the divide. So Sabine is asking, can you say something about the benefits and disadvantages to publishing OA books, both for authors and for the publisher? Perhaps Andrew, do you want to have a pop?
Yeah. So books is not my forte, but I would say that the benefits are very similar to the benefits for journals. I think the availability of the book or the journal article is the key benefit of publishing on an open access basis. I think the one thing that I would say about books is where it differs to journals is you can publish on an open access basis by chapter. So I think there are opportunities there for making your contribution to a book freely available or readily available, even if you don't have the funds to support publishing the whole book on an OA basis. In terms of disadvantages, I think the main disadvantage for publishing open access is that requirement to pay an article publishing charge, and I think the same is true for a book publishing charge for publishing books. For the publisher, I guess the main disadvantage is that protecting the value of the version of record and avoiding kind of double dipping. So you need to be careful when you're making individual chapters of a book or individual articles of a journal available on an open access basis, that you're giving the libraries and the universities and subscribers to your journal, or the people who purchase your book, enough value outside of the open access content.
Lovely, thank you very much. I think just to add to what Andrew said is that in the UK, for authors who have Research Council funding, from the 1st of January next year, the open access rules that currently apply to journal articles are extended to books. So if you've had a large research grant from one of the research councils in the UK and you publish a book from it, you may find that you have an obligation to publish open access, or at least to publish green open access. There are ways of managing this. If anybody's interested in publishing open access within the Regions and Cities book series that we publish with the Routledge Books Company, just let me know. The average price is now between £10,000 and £12,000 sterling. But there may be room for negotiation depending on the length of the book. So that was a really interesting question. Thanks very much, Sabine. Sabine's next question is quite a detailed one about Chronos Hub. So perhaps before I take that question, and I am going to just run over by 3 or 4 minutes. If I'm an author that's submitting, Sarah, to one of the regional studies journals, and my organisation doesn't have a transformative deal, what would you advise me to do as an early career researcher?
Okay, that's a good question, Sally. So first of all, I would suggest having a look on we've shared the links in the chat and we'll share the presentation afterwards, and there are some links to our publishing support pages on there. So I would take a look through those and just make sure that even if your institution doesn't necessarily have a deal with us, it may come under some of the bigger consortia agreements, or there may be other funds available to you by speaking to your librarian. So there may be other pots of money that your institution holds to enable you to publish open access. In addition, if you are publishing in a fully open access journal, or that's your intended destination for publication, There are waivers for lower income economies, and that's based on World Bank criteria. So again, in the links that we're sharing, there's some details on support with APC charges for different authors in different regions. And also, Sally, as it's an RSA presentation, I would say if you're publishing with a society journal, it's also well worth checking the society's own sites to see if they have any publication support, because for both publishers and academics and societies, in terms of impact and reach, it's really beneficial to publish open access. So there are lots of different ways of finding funds to do so. So I would make sure that you're checking some of those pages as well.
That's great. Thanks very much. I'd just like to echo that. Most learned societies, not only the Regional Studies Association, have some kind of funding to help people that have a very good case, so perhaps about a particularly policy-facing piece of work that would really benefit from open access, or people who are very early in their career or unfunded or in emerging economies. So yeah, there are funds available, and I would advise you to search widely. You've now seen that Sarah's presentation about regional studies clearly illustrated the value of publishing open access. Sarah, I've got another question for you. Well, perhaps for both of you actually, and it's a higher level, more strategic question. Why are the funders getting involved in telling researchers how to publish their work? Perhaps, Sarah, would you like to have the first go?
I'll start, and then I shall graciously bow out and allow Andrew to do the heavy lifting. Yeah, so the drive for open access, particularly in Europe, where the kind of forefront of this movement started, I guess, aimed to show value for public spend. So the idea was if research was publicly funded, that the public should have the benefit of that research, and that meant removing blockers to access, i.e. paywalls. So that started this trend along the open access path. Now, while funders will say they're not stepping in and telling researchers specifically where to publish, we know that the various different agreements have their own eligibility criteria and will therefore have limitations or constrictions or other forms of criteria that you need to apply before you be eligible for that funding. So I think publishers and funders are trying to make this as broad as possible while we're all moving towards this transition to open, but you should be aware of some of those conditions when you're looking through the agreements and looking at the publication venues to make sure that you're meeting all of those requirements. And now I'm going to hand over to my lovely colleague to do the rest.
No, I think that's wonderful, Sarah. I think there are two main advantages. I think that the main one is, as you say, particularly for publicly funded research, ensuring that that can be used and iterated upon as broadly as possible to deliver value for the taxpayers. And I think part of that is availability and accessibility, and then part of that is reuse. I think one of the main drivers that we touched on a couple of times in the slides is that retention of copyright. And I think for gold open access articles where the authors retain copyright for their work, it makes it so much easier to reuse, iterate on, build on. And I think that just, yeah, it's a key part of open science, open research to advance the iterative advancement of research.
Lovely, thank you very much. Sarah, in one sentence, can you answer Sabine's, or is this something where we can connect you with Sabine and you can deal with this quite specific query outside of the webinar?
Yeah, absolutely. Please feel free to do that.
Okay, lovely. With your permission, Sabine, I'll share your email with Sarah and we can get that question answered. So we have overrun by a few minutes. We've had a really good discussion around it. We've had very, very clear and well-evidenced explanations from our two speakers. So I would like to thank you very much indeed for doing that. And I would like to close the webinar officially now. I'd like to remind you that this webinar is part of a series of professional development webinars that we run. The list of forthcoming webinars will be found on our website. We return on the 6th of December with Elisabetta Pietrostefani practiced that before, from the University of Liverpool, and she's going to be talking about new forms of data. And knowing how much the empirically based researchers in our field love data, I'm expecting that to be quite a busy meeting. So I would like to thank our two speakers. I'd like to thank my colleagues in the RSA staff team for the work behind the scenes. And I'd like to thank all of you for joining us for today's professional development webinar. So thank you all, and we look forward to seeing you on the 6th of December for learning about new forms of data. Goodbye.